Inside a high-stakes federal courtroom in Miami, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Judge Edward Chen over a $940 million corruption case tied to Gulfstream Dynamics. Chen tries to humiliate her, shutting down her motions and dragging up her past to discredit her defense. But just minutes later, Jasmine strikes back, unleashing a storm that flips the entire courtroom and leaves Chen paralyzed in stunned silence. The atmosphere turns from contempt to chaos in seconds. If the one who holds the gavel can be bought, how many rulings were never justice at all? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Miami federal courthouse loomed like a stone fortress beneath the bruised sky, its marble pillars glinting with the first light of morning as helicopters circled above. Inside courtroom 4B, the tension was already electric. Journalists elbowed for front-row seats, cameras clicked like sniper triggers, and federal agents lined the back wall with arms crossed, eyes scanning. This wasn't just a corruption case. It was a political powder keg. Gulfstream Dynamics, a defense contractor accused of laundering millions through phony infrastructure grants, stood trial, and representing the accused was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, not just a legislator, but a former trial attorney returning to the arena that had made her and nearly broken her. The stakes, immense. The courtroom whispered of quiet sabotage, insider connections, and backroom deals stretching from Florida to D.C. But no one whispered louder than the name of the man presiding, Judge Edward Chen, a man feared for his vicious intellect, legendary bias, and icy contempt for anyone who dared to challenge him. Chen entered with the slow, deliberate pace of a man used to commanding rooms by presence alone. His black robe swayed like the curtain before an execution. No greeting, no warmth, only a glance sharp enough to cut glass as his eyes locked onto Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice dry and metallic, "I see you've returned to the courtroom. Last time didn't go so well for you, if I recall." The gallery snickered, a cruel echo bouncing off stone walls. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood at the defense table, back straight, eyes calm, the storm she'd endured hidden behind a veil of steel. "Good morning, Your Honor," she replied, voice clear and unshaken. But Chen wasn't finished. "Let's hope your legal strategy is better than your last attempt, or your client might prefer to represent himself." His words weren't just a jab. They were a scalpel, meant to undermine her authority before the trial even began. And still, she held her silence. But her silence was not submission. It was strategy. But silence, as it turned out, was only the first move in Jasmine Crockett's war of attrition. The storm did not begin with raised voices or overturned tables. It began with steel restraint. As the prosecution launched into a bloated opening filled with conjecture and dramatic flair, Judge Edward Chen let it roll unchecked. When Jasmine rose to object to a line of argument that had wandered far from the bounds of admissible evidence, Chen slammed his gavel without hesitation. "Overruled," he snapped, not even pretending to deliberate. She tried again minutes later, this time to block an exhibit that had not been disclosed in discovery. "Overruled again," he said coldly, eyes never meeting hers. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth, visible only to those watching closely. Jasmine stood there, framed by oak and marble, absorbing each blow with the grace of someone who knew the real fight was still ahead. Her shoulders never slouched. Her voice, when it returned, was never raised. But her fingers, they moved constantly, flipping pages, underlining case law, circling times, scribbling patterns of judicial misconduct with the meticulousness of someone crafting a legal trap. Not just a defense. The imbalance in the room was no longer subtle. It was an open wound. Prosecutors were allowed to ramble, to speculate, to inject emotional appeals that any first-year law student would find objectionable. Chen let them. But Jasmine? Her cross-examinations were cut off mid-sentence. Her citations were dismissed as outdated before the titles were even spoken. "Stick to the facts, Ms. Crockett," Chen interrupted as she referenced a Supreme Court precedent. "This isn't Capitol Hill." The gallery shifted. Reporters blinked. Even a few jurors exchanged glances. But Jasmine's face was carved from calm. Each time he cut her off, she marked it. Each time he raised his voice, she recorded the time. Each inconsistency, each deviation from proper judicial conduct, she logged like a litigator building a case, not just for her client, but against the man presiding above them all. And still, she made no scene, because she understood something Judge Chen did not. Sometimes the most lethal weapon in the room is the one that waits. Quiet, patient, and absolutely certain. And yet, as Jasmine Crockett continued to absorb every blow with unnerving composure, the room began to shift in ways too subtle for Judge Chen to detect, but far too deliberate to be coincidence. What appeared on the surface as her silence was, in truth, a precise orchestration. The humiliation, the interruptions, the blatant legal imbalances. She was letting them accumulate, not because she had no counterpunch, but because she needed the weight of injustice to reach critical mass. And at exactly 11:42 a.m., that moment arrived. Without a word, her co-counsel, Reuben Glass, a wiry man with a steel-trap mind and the emotional range of a chess clock, reached beneath the defense table and withdrew a manila folder sealed at both ends. The label was clean but unmistakable. DOJ, Case ID 23, JC789, Priority Classification. In the corner, a federal tracking chip glowed faintly blue under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Reuben didn't hand it to Jasmine. He slid it 1 inch to her left, tapped it once with his index finger, and locked eyes with her. A quiet signal they'd rehearsed a dozen times behind closed doors. Jasmine, still facing the judge, gave no response. No movement, no words. But her hand slowly moved to the folder and covered it, like a queen resting her palm on the throne she was about to reclaim. 2 rows behind the media gallery, a woman slipped in through the side aisle door, unnoticed by the cameras, reporters, or even the marshals. She wore no badge, no overt symbol of authority, just a crisp gray suit and matte black flats that made no sound against the marble floor. Her hair was tied back, severe and neat. From a distance, she looked like another analyst, or maybe an assistant from the U.S. Attorney's Office sent to observe. But the way she moved told a different story. Not like someone finding a seat, but like someone scanning for angles. She chose the far left corner of the gallery's back row, removed a pen from her inner jacket, and uncapped it with a faint click. Embedded in its center was a secure wireless transmitter, DOJ encrypted. The woman was Special Agent Eliza Hart, Internal Oversight Division, Department of Justice. Her presence in that courtroom hadn't been announced. Not even Jasmine had been told exactly when or how she'd arrive. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to let Judge Edward Chen think he was safe, until the very moment he proved he wasn't. Chen, of course, was far too pleased with himself to notice. Ms. Crockett, if this is what passes for legal argumentation where you're from, I suggest your client consider alternative counsel, he said, the condescension in his voice thick enough to spread with a knife. The prosecution chuckled again, loud and smug. But they didn't know what the defense had just put into motion. As Chen leaned back in his chair, self-satisfied and imperious, Agent Hart lowered her pen to the seat beside her and pressed the tiny transmitter. A light blinked red, then green. Thousands of miles away, a DOJ server began syncing live audio and metadata from courtroom 4B, cross-referencing it with a digital timeline Jasmine and her team had built. Timestamps, rulings, procedural denials, all aligned to a precise evidentiary profile. Chen thought he was mocking a public servant. In truth, he had just stepped into the jaws of a federal investigation being conducted in real time. The courtroom hadn't shifted in temperature. It had changed in pressure, and Edward Chen, who'd spent years weaponizing his bench, was now standing on a stage whose floor had just begun to crack beneath him. And while the gallery saw only a woman seated quietly behind the defense table, they missed what truly changed when the court came back to session. The air had thickened, like the room itself knew something was coming. The gavel cracked back to life at exactly 1:31 p.m., but the sound no longer carried the same authority. Something about it felt hollow now, theatrical. The courtroom was more crowded than before. Extra reporters had found ways to squeeze into the back rows, and legal aides now stood silently against the marble walls. Jasmine Crockett remained still as stone at her table, her DOJ-sealed folder resting in plain sight beside her notes, untouched but unmistakably present. Judge Edward Chen entered with a sharp flick of his robe and a forced half-smile, a man trying to reassert control over a stage he no longer fully owned. But he clung to routine like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. "Ms. Crockett," he said, barely settled in his chair, "I had the misfortune of reviewing some of your filings over lunch. It's bold, I'll give you that. Misguided, yes, but certainly confident." He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Tell me, was that the same level of preparation you brought to United States vs. Phelps? Remind me again, wasn't that the hearing where your entire argument was dismissed before opening statements?" The insult wasn't casual. It was surgical. A deliberate reach into her record, twisted to humiliate. A direct reference to a 7-year-old case where Jasmine had been handed a ruling under suspiciously rushed circumstances. A ruling later reversed, though Chen didn't mention that part. The prosecution laughed under their breath. One even elbowed his colleague as if enjoying a comedy. Chen continued, his voice louder now, playing to the audience. "If you'd like to relive that day here, we can certainly accelerate the pace. I have better uses for this courtroom's time than babysitting rhetorical grandstanding." Jasmine said nothing. She didn't even glance at him. Instead, she calmly reached for a pen and made a small mark in the margin of her legal pad. A dot. Nothing more. But on her private key, it marked the 7th recorded violation of judicial conduct that day. She folded her hands in front of her, looked up, and offered only, "If the court permits, I'd like to proceed with the evidentiary challenge outlined in our supplemental brief." Chen cut her off instantly. "You've already wasted enough paper with those," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "The court will not indulge another detour into irrelevancy." Then with a mocking grin, "Unless you've brought a miracle with your lunch break, Ms. Crockett, I suggest you stick to defending your client, not reinventing the law." The room held its breath. Jasmine's lips pressed together, not in frustration, in readiness. Because while Chen believed he was silencing her, what he had done, precisely finally, was hit the threshold she had been waiting for. The point where his arrogance stopped being an annoyance and became admissible evidence. She turned slightly, made brief eye contact with Reuben, and gave the faintest of nods. The show was almost over, and Chen didn't even realize the curtain was already falling. And just when the courtroom seemed lulled into the pattern of Judge Chen's unchecked dominance, cut her off, dismiss her motion, mock her record, Jasmine Crockett did something that shattered the rhythm like glass. She spoke, but not with raised volume, not with anger. Her voice was measured, deliberate, and impossibly calm. The kind of calm that warned of something tectonic beneath the surface. "Your Honor," she said, cutting into the judge's speech mid-sentence, the first time all day anyone had dared interrupt him. "Under judicial canon 2A, a judge shall respect and comply with the law and shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." The room reacted before the judge did. A few pens froze mid-scribble. The typing from the reporter pool stopped altogether. A juror's jaw visibly tightened. Jasmine hadn't just cited the rules. She had accused him in open court of violating the very code that legitimized his seat on the bench. Not metaphorically, legally. Her words weren't fire. They were cold steel, not meant to inflame but to pierce. She remained standing, eyes steady, hands folded, not backing down an inch. It wasn't defiance. It was assertion. It was a lawyer reclaiming the room, not by volume, but by invoking the law in the exact language that bound the man before her. Judge Chen's reaction was instantaneous and visceral. He pushed back in his chair, lips curled into something between a grin and a snarl, as if insulted that a woman he'd spent all day belittling now dared to frame him within the walls of the very system he thought he owned. "Ms. Crockett," he said, drawing her name out like a warning, "are you seriously accusing this court, my court, of violating judicial ethics?" His voice had dropped in pitch, but risen in venom. The words were quiet, but sharp as razors. He was no longer playing to the room. He was coiling, preparing to strike. Jasmine didn't waver. "I'm not accusing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice flat, professional, and fatal. "I'm formally entering it into the record." The weight of that sentence changed the air again. Not just the meaning, but the legal implication. It was no longer just a confrontation. It was the start of an official challenge. Chen stared at her, stunned, before hissing, "Then I hope for your sake, counselor, you have something more than courtroom theater and a copy of the canons, because if you're going to make this personal, you'd better bring evidence." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She let that moment hang, let his demands settle into the ears of every juror, every reporter, every silent official in the gallery. Then, without breaking eye contact, she moved her left hand slowly to the sealed DOJ folder beside her. She didn't open it, not yet. But the message was unmistakable. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to threaten. She simply let him see what was waiting. And for the first time since the morning gavel struck, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. And when Jasmine Crockett's fingers finally broke the seal on the DOJ folder, the entire courtroom seemed to inhale and then forget how to exhale. She rose, not with theatrical flair, but with the solemnity of someone about to bury something, or someone. "With the court's permission," she said, voice unwavering, "I will now enter into the record a series of documents obtained legally through federal channels and authenticated by the Department of Justice." There was no objection. There couldn't be. Even Judge Chen, now unnaturally still in his chair, didn't move to interrupt her. She held up a slim binder, its tab marked Exhibit A. "This includes logs of 7 private meetings between Your Honor and Mr. Maxwell Harrington, CEO of Gulfstream Dynamics, occurring at private residences, closed-door clubs, and 1 unlisted yacht in international waters off the Florida coast." The first page flipped onto the evidence card with a sharp slap, each entry time-stamped, GPS-tagged, and confirmed through subpoenaed cell tower triangulation. Each meeting took place within 72 hours of a major procedural ruling favorable to Gulfstream's interests. The courtroom was silent, not the quiet of confusion, the silence of disbelief sharpening into fear. She did not pause. She opened Exhibit B. "Here are certified transaction records showing offshore wire transfers totaling $3.75 million over a span of 11 months. Each deposit traces back to holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and each routes, eventually, to an account under the name E.M. Chen Trust." A ripple moved through the gallery, not just audible, but physical, like a tremor underfoot. Even the prosecution turned, whispering frantically among themselves. "These transfers coincide precisely with Your Honor's suppression of defense motions in cases involving federal procurement contracts." She laid out printouts of the transactions, page by page, like setting down a trail of footprints leading straight to the bench. Then she opened Exhibit C. "And finally, emails retrieved under warrant from Mr. Harrington's private server. One in particular, dated October 6th of last year, reads," and I quote, "The judge has assured me the outcome will be controlled. Everything is greenlit." She let the words hang. There was no need to dramatize them. The gallery, the jury, the clerk, even the walls seemed to recoil. In less than 4 minutes, the power dynamic that had ruled courtroom 4B all morning collapsed like scaffolding set on fire from the inside. Reporters typed with mechanical violence. A juror gasped audibly. The court sketch artist paused midline, stunned by the expression now frozen on Chen's face. Not rage, not denial, but something far more dangerous. Fear. Jasmine stood still. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't looked away. She had simply held up a mirror to corruption and let it reflect its own rot. For the first time in his career, Judge Edward Chen wasn't speaking. He wasn't ruling. He wasn't towering over anyone. He was exposed, and the entire courtroom could feel it. And as the final line of that email, "The judge has assured me the outcome will be controlled," reverberated through the air like a live wire. The silence that followed wasn't simply stunned. It was the kind of silence that falls right before a structure gives way. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of order, but a place hanging on the edge of collapse. It was Jasmine Crockett, who stepped forward, her hands steady as she opened a narrow black case file marked only with the initials 23J C789 and the insignia of the U.S. Department of Justice. The seal broke with a quiet snap, but the force behind it was enough to shake the walls of power in that room. She nodded once, and Agent Eliza Hart, now seated just behind the defense, rose from her bench and handed a supplemental affidavit to the court clerk. No one in the room had seen her move. She had been still as stone until this moment. The clerk, pale-faced, unfolded the document and delivered it to the bench. Chen took it with a hand that trembled, just barely, but enough that the gallery noticed. Jasmine's voice returned with precision. Your Honor, what has been presented so far, the meetings, the offshore transactions, the private correspondence, are not isolated findings. For the past 11 months, the Department of Justice, in coordination with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, has been conducting an active classified investigation into a pattern of judicial misconduct involving multiple federal rulings, with this bench at the center. She turned toward the projection monitor as Agent Hart keyed in the encrypted credentials. The screen lit up with a clean interface. FBI Digital Archive, verified assets. One by one, files appeared. Folders labeled wire transfers, audio surveillance, private email chains, call logs, shell corporations. These materials, Jasmine continued, have been authenticated by DOJ forensic auditors, voice verified through biometric analysis, and matched against financial records obtained by federal subpoena. Then came the sound, not a loud one. A soft click as Agent Hart played the first audio clip. Chen's voice emerged from the speakers, clear and unambiguous. Make sure the Harrington contract lands where it's supposed to. I don't want anything screwing this up. Another clip. Delay the motion. Stall it out. The longer the defense wobbles, the better this looks for us. The words weren't just damning. They were surgical strikes against the very foundation of his authority. Not speculation, not suggestion. His voice, his words, his intent. Jasmine didn't move, didn't speak. She let the recordings speak for themselves. Across the courtroom, the shift was immediate. Not whispered disbelief, but visceral reaction. A juror in the front row leaned back as if physically struck. Another turned her head slowly toward the bench, her eyes wide, filled with something close to horror. Even the prosecution table had fallen into complete silence, their lead counsel's pen still in his hand, frozen mid-note. No one was looking at Jasmine anymore. Every single person in that room, from the sketch artist to the bailiff, was staring at Edward Chen. But this time, they weren't seeing a judge. They weren't seeing a figure of law. They were seeing a man unraveling beneath the weight of his own fraud, exposed on the very stage he had once used to dominate others. And still, Jasmine stood, silent, collected, as if she had known from the beginning that this moment would come. And as the final clip of Chen's voice dissolved into the thick, electrified air, a man cloaked in authority openly manipulating the outcome of a federal trial, Jasmine Crockett did not hesitate. She stepped forward, her heels echoing on the marble floor like a war drum. The silence that met her words wasn't born of confusion. It was the kind of silence that precedes irreversible change. Your Honor, she said, standing tall with the DOJ case file still open on the desk beside her. In light of the overwhelming and authenticated evidence of misconduct, the defense formally moves to immediately suspend these proceedings under emergency grounds. The integrity of this courtroom has been compromised beyond recovery. Justice cannot proceed here. Not like this. She said it without flinching, without raising her voice. But the force of her words cut through the chambers like a judicial scalpel, slicing through decades of pretense. Before Judge Chen could even part his lips to respond, Special Agent Eliza Hart had already stepped into the aisle, signaling toward the gallery. The door swung open behind her, and through them came Lauren Vasquez, Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, her badge gleaming, her face expressionless. She walked past the stunned spectators, past the bench, and stood directly in front of the court. Per DOJ emergency oversight protocol, she began, her voice resonating with finality. Judge Edward Chen is hereby suspended from the bench, effective immediately, pending formal investigation and potential prosecution under the RICO Act. There was no gavel strike, no official acknowledgement, because the moment itself was louder than any sound could match. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Reporters scrambled to raise cameras. Members of the prosecution sat frozen, as if realizing too late that the ship they had boarded was now sinking. And Chen, the man who had spent the morning silencing others, sat utterly mute. His hands clenched the arms of his chair, his knuckles pale, the warrant envelope in his grip trembling slightly as if it carried the weight of his unraveling identity. Vasquez turned back to the gallery, her eyes sweeping over every set of stunned faces. This trial is suspended, effective immediately. All pending motions are void. A new judge will be assigned, and a full federal review of all rulings issued by Judge Chen over the past 5 years will commence within 48 hours. Not a sound followed. Not from the court staff, not from the media, not even from Chen himself. He had been reduced, not by outrage or revenge, but by the methodical, inescapable exposure of truth. For the first time since he entered the courtroom that morning, Judge Edward Chen was no longer presiding over anything. He wasn't feared. He wasn't revered. He was watched, not with respect, but with scrutiny. And Jasmine Crockett, the woman he had tried to belittle, now stood at the very center of a reckoning that would echo through every marble hall in the federal system. And as the final syllables of Deputy Director Vasquez's declaration echoed into stunned silence, the courtroom no longer felt like a judicial chamber. It felt like ground zero. Just outside, chaos detonated. The courthouse plaza, moments earlier subdued under the weight of heat and ritual, had become a media war zone. Satellite vans from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and global outlets like BBC and Al Jazeera lined the curb like tanks. Cameramen shoved tripods into position as producers barked into earpieces. Reporters shouted questions into microphones even though they had no one to direct them at yet. Anchors were already live, their tones breathless. In an unprecedented development, a federal judge has been suspended mid-trial under corruption allegations. The front steps of the courthouse were cordoned off by U.S. Marshals, but that didn't stop the crowd. Protesters, lawyers, journalists, law students, all surged forward, phones raised, lenses zoomed, chasing even a glimpse of anyone coming out of courtroom 4B. Inside, the impact rippled in quieter, more dangerous ways. The prosecution table, just hours ago smug and dominant, now looked like a pile of ash in tailored suits. One junior prosecutor whispered nervously to her supervisor, who didn't respond, just stared straight ahead like someone watching his reflection dissolve in acid. Moments later, two senior prosecutors approached Deputy Director Vasquez in the side aisle. Their voices were low but urgent. Jasmine could only make out fragments, previous rulings, sealed motions, potential conflicts. They weren't just reacting. They were trying to preempt something, cover a trail, untangle themselves. The spectacle wasn't just destroying one judge. It was exposing a rot that had tentacled into more than one set of hands. The fear on their faces wasn't theatrical. It was survival instinct. And still, Jasmine Crockett stood where she had all along, motionless behind her table, hands resting calmly on the DOJ evidence folder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The thunder she'd unleashed was still rolling through the marble bones of the courthouse, and now for once, it wasn't just her feeling the tremor. For years, she had sat in courtrooms like this, spoken truth into rooms that silenced her, cited law to men who pretended not to hear, stood her ground while power draped itself in condescension and robes. She had been labeled too loud, too emotional, too ambitious. Today, she said nothing, and the silence carried her voice farther than any firestorm ever had. In the jury box, the air was still heavy, but something shifted, something personal. Juror number 6, an older black woman with white hair pulled back into a low bun and a notepad filled with meticulous cursive, looked up from the chaos and locked eyes with Jasmine. No smile, no words, just a slow, deliberate nod. The kind that says, I saw everything, I felt it too, and I know what it cost you to survive it. Jasmine met her gaze without blinking. For a second, time stilled. In that unspoken exchange, there was recognition, solidarity, and quiet, righteous fury, not at what had happened in this courtroom today, but at the truth that it had taken this long to happen at all. In the hallway, echoes of shouted headlines bounced off the walls. Federal judge suspended. Live update. Courtroom 4B. Did DOJ act too late? Was this just the tip of a deeper scandal? Microphones angled toward anyone exiting the chamber doors. Even the court sketch artist was surrounded by reporters demanding glimpses of her drawings. Rough images of Jasmine standing firm, Chen collapsing into silence, Vasquez flanked by agents. A security officer announced a full building lockdown for the next hour. The corridors of justice had become a spectacle, and for once the cameras weren't there to reduce a woman like Jasmine to caricature. They were there to witness the blow she had struck, and still she hadn't moved. Not really. She gathered her materials with careful precision, one page at a time, like someone packing away evidence of a war crime. Reuben Glass stood beside her now, silent, not smiling, but vibrating with something close to awe. He didn't speak either. He didn't have to. Every member of that defense team knew they had crossed into a moment that would be studied in law schools, cited in oversight hearings, whispered about in judges' chambers across the country. They didn't just challenge the bench, they put it on trial, and it broke. Somewhere behind her, a clerk's voice wavered into the microphone. This courtroom is now adjourned until further notice. But the words barely registered, because everyone inside already knew this courtroom wasn't coming back. Not in the form it once held, not with the same reverence. Something had been exposed, and exposure rewrites the rules. In the span of an afternoon, a judge was unseated, a trial was suspended, a power structure was cracked at its root, and at the center of it all stood the woman the system had once tried to underestimate. The thunder outside grew louder, reporters now calling her name. Congresswoman Crockett. Ms. Crockett, what happens next? Did you expect the judge to fall like this? But Jasmine didn't answer. She hadn't come to perform. She had come to reveal, and she had done exactly that. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was the first real shift in a system built to resist change. And for the first time in years, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel like she was standing on someone else's ground. She felt the marble beneath her feet shake and knew the tremor had come from her own steps. And while the tremors of Jasmine Crockett's revelations still rippled through the courthouse walls, something more chilling unfolded. Not with sirens or shouting, but with a slow, suffocating quiet. In that stillness, Judge Edward Chen, once the sovereign of courtroom 4B, found himself standing not as the final authority, but as the solitary shadow of a man whose kingdom had collapsed in real time. He was not escorted. He was not restrained. No cuffs glinted on his wrists. No agents flanked his side. And yet, in every sense that mattered, Edward Chen was now a prisoner inside his own courtroom. Where once his voice had cracked the air like a whip, now not even the sound of his breath commanded attention. No one looked directly at him. Not the jury, not the clerks, not even the bailiff who had stood sharply at his side just hours earlier. The same people who once rose when he entered now pretended not to see him, as if looking at him too long might invite guilt by association. The bench behind which he had loomed for years now towered above him in silence, cold and distant. His gavel sat untouched, a dull, impotent relic of a power that had evaporated without ceremony. He glanced at it briefly, perhaps instinctively, but didn't reach for it. What would have once been the instrument of control now looked like a prop from a play whose audience had already left. When the DOJ agents entered, they didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't even need to approach him. It was his own judicial assistant, Michael Sloan, a man who had carried Chen's briefcase into courtrooms for the past 6 years, who delivered the blow. He approached the bench slowly, stiff with the discomfort of betrayal wrapped in protocol. Judge Chen, Sloan said quietly, eyes never fully lifting from the ground. The Department of Justice has requested to conduct a preliminary statement with you, in your chambers, privately. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning wasn't lost on anyone in the room. It was no request. It was the start of a dismantling. Chen didn't speak. He didn't protest. He only nodded once, not as a judge giving permission, but as a man surrendering the last piece of illusion he had. For a brief moment, he adjusted the sleeve of his robe, smoothing the fabric out with trembling fingers. But no gesture of control, no folding of cloth, no posture could undo what had just been revealed. As he stepped down from the bench, the difference in his gait was stark. The confident, deliberate march that had carried him through thousands of hearings was gone. In its place was a fragile, almost uncertain shuffle. His shoes, once polished to a judicial gleam, scuffed softly against the marble floor, like they were carrying not just his weight, but the collapsing scaffolding of his legacy. He passed the defense table slowly. Rubin glass shifted slightly in place, but Jasmine remained perfectly still. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her silence now was louder than any speech. It was not vengeance that held her still. It was resolve. She had done what generations of attorneys before her had tried and failed to do. Bring a robed tyrant to his knees not with emotion, but with evidence. Chen didn't glance at her either. He couldn't. To look at her now was to face the unbearable, not just exposure, but defeat, and not at the hands of a system, but at the hands of a woman he had spent the day trying to humiliate. Every step toward the side door stretched like a slow funeral march. Only this time, the casket held not a body, but a career. As the door creaked open, a sound that felt indecent in its intimacy, everyone in the courtroom turned slightly, not to see where he was going, but to confirm what had happened. That the man who had once ruled this room with smirking contempt now had to be asked to leave it. Chen crossed the threshold, the door closed behind him with a soft but final click. And just like that, he was gone. But his absence didn't erase him. It exposed him. A silence lingered, thick, awkward, oppressive. Not the kind that invited reflection, but the kind that pressed on every chest like a slow-building pressure system. No one spoke. Even the court reporter's hands had gone still, resting beside her stenotype like they too had nothing left to record. The bailiff, arms usually crossed in silent authority, now stood with hands at his sides, eyes lowered. On the prosecution side, files were being quietly gathered, but no one dared make eye contact. It was as if they were cleaning up a crime scene, not finishing a trial. Outside, through the small rectangular windows set high along the back wall, reporters swarmed like hornets in the Florida sun. Flashes popped every few seconds. Microphones stretched upward toward the courthouse's steps, like a forest of hungry arms. But inside, the heat came from something else entirely. The recognition that power had changed hands, and that everyone in that room had witnessed a moment that would outlive them all. In the front row of the gallery, a woman slowly reached into her purse and pulled out a notepad she hadn't touched since the opening statements. She wrote one line, folded the paper in half, and clutched it to her chest. On the jury bench, juror number 6, the older woman who had watched every exchange with a kind of knowing restraint, closed her notepad, laid her hands across it, and turned ever so slightly toward Jasmine. And there it was, the nod. Not one of approval, not even of praise, but of recognition. A silent communion. The kind of gesture that only exists between women who have endured the quiet cruelty of being dismissed, then dared to rise anyway. And Jasmine, for her part, received it without a smile, without words. Her expression didn't change, but in her stillness, there was the quiet of a reckoning. She had not raised her voice all day. She hadn't slammed her fist. She hadn't demanded justice. She had simply brought it, piece by piece, document by document, until there was nowhere left for injustice to hide. And now, standing in the hushed remnants of the courtroom, she didn't appear triumphant. She appeared undeniable. Every camera outside was pointed toward the hallway where Chen would eventually exit. But no one in that hallway would see what the courtroom had just witnessed. A man who had once walked like a king now moved like a question with no answer. Inside his private chambers, the DOJ agents waited. No cuffs, no spotlight, just a table, a recorder, and a list of questions that would unthread the rest of his career thread by thread. But none of that mattered here. What mattered was that the robe no longer protected him. The bench no longer elevated him. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. He was not in handcuffs, but he was caged. Not by bars, but by truth, by exposure, by the irreversible weight of being seen not as a judge, but as a man who believed he was above judgment. And in that most poetic twist of fate, it wasn't the system that punished him. It was the very system he thought he could manipulate, finally operating as it should in the hands of someone who refused to let it fail. And as Judge Edward Chen disappeared behind the side door into the custody of the very justice system he had twisted to his advantage, the emotional gravity inside courtroom 4B didn't subside. It deepened, sharpened, and shifted its focus. The storm had passed, yes, but in its wake, there stood only one figure left unshaken, not because she had escaped the blast, but because she had lit the fuse herself. Deputy Director Vasquez, standing near the defense table, took 2 steps toward the gallery and turned to face the remaining court staff, jurors, and DOJ observers. Her words were clear and intentional, spoken not as a statement of record, but as a correction to history. "Let it be known," she said, voice firm and echoing in the silence Chen had once filled, "that this investigation did not begin at random. It did not begin because of a whistleblower in a distant agency. It began because Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, as private counsel in this case, submitted a sealed, corroborated intelligence packet to our office 4 months ago. She gathered it piece by piece, case by case, motion by motion, and she did so without public spectacle, without leaks, and at significant professional risk." That moment landed harder than any gavel ever could. Gasps didn't follow. Only the kind of reverent quiet that often precedes a standing ovation, though this courtroom wasn't built for applause. It wasn't happenstance. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a last-minute miracle caught on tape. It was deliberate architecture, a legal siege designed in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when no one was watching, no one was recording, and no one believed it would work. Jasmine hadn't exposed a corrupt judge by accident. She had built the scaffolding herself, carried the weight alone, and planted every explosive with care, and then simply waited for the man in the robe to strike the match. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. As Vasquez returned to the DOJ officials in the gallery, Jasmine remained exactly where she was, standing with one hand resting lightly on her briefcase, the other gripping a legal pad she no longer needed. Rubin leaned toward her, whispering something, a question maybe, or an offer to speak to the press. But she shook her head slowly. Her gaze was distant now, not out of detachment, but out of clarity. The courtroom was no longer a battlefield. It was a crater, and the mission was complete. Outside the chamber doors, dozens of reporters waited, microphones in hand, shouting her name as if they had known her the whole time. They hadn't. Hours ago, they had barely noticed when she walked into the building. Hours ago, they had eyes only for the man in the robe and the spectacle they expected him to command. But now the narrative had flipped, and the world was hungry for a quote. Something to put on headlines, on tweets, on breaking news banners flashing across television screens. She walked out slowly, flanked by her legal team, her face unreadable beneath the glow of camera flashes and shouts. "Ms. Crockett, how long have you known about the corruption? Congresswoman, will you be pressing for criminal charges? Is this the beginning of a broader investigation?" She kept walking, her heels steady against the concrete, her silhouette razor-sharp beneath the courthouse lights. There were no bodyguards, no podium, no teleprompter. Just a woman who had stared down a judicial monster and didn't blink. At the top of the courthouse steps, she paused. She turned not to the cameras but to the cluster of young interns standing behind the press line. Law students, aides, interns from both political parties who had watched the hearing unfold like a trial out of myth. Her eyes scanned them slowly, and then she spoke. Only once. "Not everyone who holds the gavel," she said, her voice low but unmistakable, "is a guardian of justice." Then she turned back to the courthouse, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the crowd. That sentence would be quoted in every newspaper by nightfall. It would be printed on posters, tweeted by pundits, carved into protest signs. Law professors would assign it as required reading. Politicians would misquote it to fit their own narratives. But in that moment, raw and unfiltered, it wasn't a statement for history. It was a verdict, not against one man, but against a system that had for too long mistaken performance for principle and silence for consent. Back inside, the courtroom remained open but inert, the bench empty, the gavel untouched, the flags still, as if even they were waiting to see what would happen next. And maybe that was the point. Justice hadn't come from the seal above the bench or the marble beneath their feet. It hadn't come from title or tenure or procedural authority. It had come from preparation, precision, and patience. And from one woman's refusal to let misconduct go unchallenged simply because it wore a robe. For 4 months, Jasmine Crockett had worked in shadows, assembling pieces no one else had bothered to see, interviewing former clerks off the record, digging into corporate filings hidden behind offshore shells, tracking campaign donations that matched suspicious court rulings down to the week. Each night she stayed late in a windowless office, each email thread she decrypted, each subpoena she quietly convinced a magistrate to approve. They had all led here. And now, standing beneath the vaulted sky of a courthouse that would never forget her name, she let the work speak for itself. No shouting, no revenge, no celebration. Just the cold, unstoppable forward motion of truth, brought to bear by someone who never needed to scream to be heard. Not everyone who holds the gavel is a guardian of justice, but sometimes the guardian walks in from the outside and breaks the gavel in half. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words vanished into the roar of news anchors and camera flashes, the echo of her quiet rebellion continued to fracture the very foundations of the federal judiciary. The trial may have ended, the courtroom emptied, the gavel silenced, but the shockwaves were just beginning to hit Washington. What happened in courtroom 4B was no longer viewed as an isolated scandal. It was the trigger, the lightning bolt that illuminated the silhouette of a much darker storm. Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice issued a classified internal memo to top-level officials across multiple branches. A directive marked Interagency Priority Review. Its title was blunt, the kind that didn't require nuance. Judicial Corporate Financial Entanglement, Phase 1 Review Targets. The contents? Explosive. The DOJ confirmed what many feared but never dared say aloud, that the corruption exposed in the case of Judge Edward Chen may only be the first breach in a dam of hidden transactions, corporate favors, and judicial backroom dealings that had remained buried for years beneath layers of procedural immunity. This wasn't just a corruption inquiry. It was a structural audit of the American legal system's highest floors, and it would shake the towers of power in ways no election, no leak, and no scandal had done before. The investigation, codenamed Operation Threshold, was launched under the joint command of the DOJ's Public Integrity Section, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and the Office of the Inspector General. At its core was a single, chilling premise: how many federal judges had become silent partners in corporate empires? Within days, agents began freezing travel records, issuing broad subpoenas to subpoena-resistant third parties, and securing emergency warrants for sealed banking documents tied to judicial trusts and family foundations. The targets weren't just judges. They were their clerks, their assistants, their former law firms, and, most explosively, the corporate legal departments of Fortune 500 defense contractors, fossil fuel conglomerates, and AI development firms with cases pending in federal courts. Emails once considered untouchable under judicial privilege were quietly reclassified. Shell corporations registered in Malta, Singapore, the British Virgin Islands, all suddenly found their encryption pierced by court orders signed by special panels working under DOJ jurisdiction. And at the center of it all, visible only to those tracking the investigation's origin, was the name Crockett. The media's frenzy over Chen's suspension quickly morphed into something darker, more urgent. Late-night segments ran side-by-side photos of judges and CEOs at charity galas, hunting lodges, and undisclosed retreats. A spreadsheet leaked to a major news outlet showed a pattern too consistent to ignore. 38 federal rulings in the past decade that benefited 6 corporations disproportionately, all handed down by judges with overlapping investments or undisclosed family ties to those very corporations. Suddenly, the term judicial independence no longer inspired confidence. It provoked suspicion. For Jasmine, the aftermath was not vindication. It was confirmation of a suspicion she had carried alone for years. She had argued cases where defense motions vanished from the docket. She had watched prosecutors breeze through evidentiary hurdles that should have stopped them cold. She had stood in silent courtrooms where glares replaced due process. What she unearthed in Chen's case wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint, a behavioral pattern that extended beyond one courtroom, beyond one city, beyond even one ideology. She had once been ridiculed for pressing too hard on financial disclosures, called paranoid for suggesting judges should be subject to the same scrutiny as elected officials, told to sit down when questioning the overlap between campaign donations and case outcomes. But now, the same legal scholars who once dismissed her concerns were publishing op-eds in The Atlantic titled, "Was Jasmine Crockett Right All Along?" And while she made no public appearances in the days that followed, her silence only amplified the weight of her role. DOJ spokespeople didn't dare downplay her contributions. In fact, Deputy Director Vasquez was quoted directly, "The investigation would not exist without her. This is not just about one corrupt judge. It's about a judiciary that has gone unexamined for too long." Capitol Hill responded with characteristic panic. Senate Judiciary Committee members demanded closed-door briefings. Internal compliance divisions at major firms ordered immediate reviews of all legal partnerships. A classified subcommittee was hastily formed to review whether judicial lifetime appointments should be amended to allow for mid-career audits, a move considered political suicide only months earlier. Now a mainstream talking point. Whispers of impeachment inquiries began to swirl, not for the usual reasons, but for silence, for complicity, for trading access to legal leniency in exchange for corporate privilege. Still, the question lingered like a match held over dry paper. How deep did it go? A federal intelligence analyst leaked a redacted map to a major investigative outlet. It outlined suspected nodes in what one internal memo labeled a judicial influence network. There were names, not revealed publicly, but known behind closed doors. Judges in New York, Los Angeles, Houston. Corporate board members with prior careers in federal litigation. Offshore accounts with traceable backdoors to retirement trusts. One line in the map had a label that sent chills through every agency that read it. The bench is not blind, it's bought. Inside the DOJ's operations center, Jasmine's original packet of evidence remained under secure lock and biometric access. Investigators treated it as both blueprint and warning. This was the level of work required to crack the door open. The Crockett dossier, as it came to be known in internal circles, wasn't just documentation. It was proof that one woman, working without institutional power, had exposed what layers of oversight had failed to see, or perhaps had chosen not to. Reporters camped outside her home. Her team fielded over 200 interview requests in 3 days. But Jasmine refused to speak. She had no interest in being a celebrity. She didn't need her name in lights. She wanted change. Measurable, systemic, irreversible change. And for the first time in her career, she could feel it. Not just in articles, not just in legislation, but in the tremor under the feet of those who had believed their robes made them untouchable. Justice had been tested, and for once it didn't break. It bent, it trembled, but it held, and only because someone outside the circle had been willing to challenge its sacred illusion. As a second DOJ task force formed, this one aimed at developing a national database of judge corporate financial overlaps, the headlines grew bolder. The Crockett effect. The gavel cracks. Justice audited. But Jasmine, even in her silence, remained unmoved by praise. She knew too well what it had cost to reach this moment. 4 months of coded emails, encrypted drives, sleepless nights. 4 months of being doubted, gaslit, and warned that pushing too far would destroy her career. But she had pushed anyway, because the damage was already there. The only question was whether anyone would name it. Now it was named. Now it was real. And now it was burning its way through the federal system like sunlight hitting dry leaves. The courtroom had emptied. The cameras had moved on. But in the secure back rooms of the Justice Department, the real reckoning had just begun. And it had Jasmine Crockett's signature written all over it. And as the DOJ's interagency investigation thundered forward like a blade through velvet, Jasmine Crockett's name rose above the noise. Not as a partisan lightning rod, not as a rising star, but as the embodiment of moral force inside a crumbling system. Her silence was now louder than anyone else's words, and Washington, for once, had the sense to listen. The official invitation arrived at dawn, sealed, hand-delivered, and bearing the full weight of institutional urgency. It was not merely symbolic, it was a concession, a quiet admittance that the system she once stood outside of, questioning with righteous fury, now needed her to help save it from itself. The Judicial Ethics Committee, long regarded as ceremonial and toothless, extended its most serious ask in decades. Jasmine was requested to serve as special counsel to the Federal Judicial Conduct Oversight Board. Not tomorrow, not pending approval, immediately. No podium, no press conference, no boastful soundbite. Just her name in bold black ink and a nation holding its breath. She didn't answer the letter with words. She answered it with action. That morning, as Capitol Hill buzzed with reporters and congressional aides refreshing their feeds by the second, one image began to dominate timelines and airwaves alike. It wasn't a shot of courtroom chaos or Chen's unraveling. It was Jasmine, caught mid-turn, standing at the defense table in that fateful hearing. Her eyes were leveled, her shoulders squared, not in triumph, but in defiance. One hand on a binder, the other clenched at her side. Behind her, the chaos of a collapsing courtroom. But in that frame, she looked like the only fixed point in a spinning world. The photo flooded social media with a caption that didn't scream, but whispered with weight. Not a victor, a storm anchor. From Harvard Law to Howard University, classrooms paused lectures to break down her tactics, her composure, her legal mastery. Overnight, students were quoting her opening statements in moot court competitions. Seasoned prosecutors re-examined past rulings where her voice had once been dismissed. Entire podcasts were devoted to one question: how did she see it coming when no one else did? And the answer kept echoing in every corner of legal commentary, because she never stopped watching the system, even when it refused to watch her. When Jasmine entered the vaulted chamber of the Judicial Ethics Committee for her first closed session, she didn't wait to be introduced. She stepped forward, opened her binder, and began. "There's no point in pretending this committee still holds the public's trust," she said, eyes scanning a room full of judges, senators, legal clerks, and ethics officers. "Trust isn't granted by title. It's earned by action. And right now, the American people are watching this room to see if we're ready to act, or just continue performing." Silence fell. A different kind of silence. The kind that came not from protocol, but from discomfort. Because truth has a sound when it hits too hard to ignore. Her demands weren't radical. They were surgical. Mandatory financial disclosure audits for all Article 3 judges, quarterly ethics reviews, not yearly ones, public registries of judicial-sponsored trips, corporate gifts, and affiliated nonprofit donations. And above all, enforcement teeth. Penalties, disqualification clauses, real consequences. No more warnings. No more wrist slaps disguised as reprimands. The days of robes shielding rot were over. She laid it out like a prosecutor preparing her closing argument. But there was no fury in her tone. Just clarity, razor sharp, impossible to deny. Even those who had once mocked her as too emotional or too aggressive now leaned in with a mixture of admiration and unease. Because it was clear that Jasmine wasn't appealing for reform. She was dragging the system toward it, whether it was ready or not. Outside the room, the response was immediate. Journalists called it the Crockett Doctrine. Advocacy groups released statements of support within hours. Federal law clerks across the country whispered to each other in elevators and back rooms, "She's changing the code in real time." But Jasmine didn't care about headlines. She didn't even watch the coverage. When asked by a junior staffer if she wanted to approve her own press release, she said simply, "Let the work speak," and walked on. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, young attorneys pinned her photo above their desks, not because she won, but because she stood in the storm, in the fire, in the space where so many had folded or fled. That evening, as the committee recessed, a camera captured one last frame. Jasmine walking down a marble hallway, the gold-banded binder still in her hands, heels echoing with every step. She didn't wave. She didn't look up. But the camera caught her reflection in the polished floor, and in it, she looked like something more than a lawyer or a lawmaker. She looked like the reckoning the system had never prepared for. And across a nation still reeling, still reckoning, still questioning whether justice was real or just another costume for power, one truth stood clear. The gavel no longer belonged to the judge. It belonged to the woman who dared to question why it ever had. And as the headlines faded and the cameras moved on to newer crises, what remained wasn't the scandal or the viral moment or even the procedural reforms. What remained was something deeper, something quiet and uncomfortable and necessary. In the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with power, a question began to haunt every chamber of law, every boardroom, every civic hall across the country. How many systems have we mistaken for justice, simply because they wore the right clothes and spoke the right words? This wasn't just about a single corrupt judge. It was about the invisible architecture that allowed men like Edward Chen to rise, unchecked, to the highest platforms of authority. It was about how respectability became a disguise, how titles became armor, and how too often we confuse power with integrity. Jasmine had cracked open more than a courtroom. She had cracked open the illusion that justice is guaranteed simply by process. Her battle revealed that fairness is not built into the walls of institutions. It is carried, one person at a time, by those courageous enough to call the institution's bluff. For every moment Jasmine was interrupted, disrespected, condescended to, she didn't just endure. She remembered. She wrote it down. She turned every slight into a data point, every dismissal into ammunition. And when the time came, she didn't respond with fury. She responded with precision. That is the true cost of change. Not just passion, but restraint. Not just outrage, but strategy. And that is what shook the nation to its core. Not that a woman had stood up to a corrupt man in robes, but that she did it without becoming what she was fighting. The human lesson lies in that tension, in the tightrope between silence and noise. Jasmine taught us that sometimes the most radical act is not to shout louder, but to prepare longer. Not to destroy everything, but to choose which pillar to strike so the whole rot falls in one clean motion. She didn't humiliate her enemy. She revealed him. She didn't burn down the courtroom. She changed who it served. And in doing so, she reminded the world of something dangerously forgotten in the modern age of spectacle. Justice is not the performance of virtue. It is the discipline of truth. It is slow, grueling, thankless work. It requires listening more than speaking, gathering more than reacting, and standing firm when everyone else has fled. Jasmine did not emerge from this story unscarred, but that's what made her triumph matter. It was not gifted to her. It was earned with bruises no camera ever caught. So the lesson, in the end, is not about Jasmine Crockett alone. It is about everyone watching, everyone reading, everyone asking what they would do in that room, under those lights facing that kind of pressure. The real transformation wasn't just in the system she exposed. It was in the quiet awakening of people who realize they too have a choice. To stay silent, or to prepare, to play along, or to anchor themselves in the storm. And perhaps that's the most human truth of all. Sometimes the bravest people are the ones who speak least, until it matters most. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.